There's a kind of silence that only exists after everything has already gone wrong. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of rest. The silence of a man sitting on the floor of a room he no longer recognizes, in a life he no longer understands, wondering how in God's name he got here, when just a few years ago, the whole country knew his name. That silence has a smell. It smells like cheap whiskey and 3-day-old takeout boxes and the particular staleness of curtains that haven't been open in weeks. It sounds like a ceiling fan clicking on its third rotation. It feels like carpet fibers under the palms of hands that once held lives in them, other men's lives, missions, decisions that mattered. His name was Marcus, and before the floor, before the curtains, before the silence, Marcus Webb was the kind of man other men pointed at. Not with envy, with something older than envy. With the look boys give to something they want to become before they know what becoming costs. He grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, in a house that sat close enough to the water that the salt air got into everything. The furniture, the curtains, his mother's hair, his own lungs. He breathed salt before he breathed ambition. His father worked the docks before his knees gave out, and after the knees, he worked the couch. His mother cleaned other people's houses 6 days a week, and came home smelling like someone else's pine sol, and someone else's cooking, and she never once complained about it. Not where Marcus could hear. That woman built him out of something harder than love. She built him out of example. He was 17 when he saw the recruiter at his high school gym, standing next to a folding table with a Navy banner that had seen better days. Marcus wasn't supposed to be interested. He had a scholarship conversation happening with a mid-tier college about running track. He had a girlfriend who thought he hung the moon. He had a plan that was small but real, and small but real was more than most boys from his block could say. But the recruiter looked at him, really looked the way very few adults had, and said something Marcus never forgot. You look like a man who needs something harder than what he's got. It wasn't a sales pitch. It was almost an insult. And Marcus walked straight to that table and picked up the pamphlet. 2 years later, he was in Coronado, California, getting his soul extracted through his boots. Bud/S, basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, is not a place you survive with talent. Talent gets you there. What keeps you, there is something harder to name. It lives somewhere between the stomach and the spine, in the place where quitting lives too, and every single day is a negotiation between those two things. The cold water of San Diego Bay doesn't care who you were before you got in. The instructors don't care. The sand that gets into everything, your ears, your eyes, the corners of your mouth, does not care. Marcus cared. He cared with a ferocity that scared even him sometimes. In Hell Week, 5.5 days of near-continuous training on less than 4 hours of sleep total, when men were dropping around him like candles in wind, some of them sobbing, some of them just quietly walking to the bell and ringing it. And that was that Marcus was finding something inside himself he hadn't known was there. It wasn't strength. Strength runs out. It was something closer to stubbornness, dressed up in a purpose it didn't yet fully understand. He rang no bell. He graduated. He became a Navy SEAL. And for the next 11 years, he was exactly what the recruiter had seen in him, a man who needed something harder than what he had, and who had found it, and who was genuinely, deeply good at it. 3 deployments. 2 to Afghanistan. 1 to a place he still doesn't name at dinner tables. He led men into situations that don't make it into the briefings that get declassified, in buildings where the wrong call meant everything, in the kind of dark that has nothing to do with the absence of light. He was not reckless. He was not a cowboy. He was precise the way a surgeon is precise, not cold, but controlled, understanding that control in that moment is the most loving thing a leader can offer the men behind him. His men trusted him the way you trust gravity. That trust cost him something he didn't realize he was spending. The first sign was the dreams. Not nightmares in the Hollywood sense. No slow-motion replays, no screaming. Just wrong. The geometry of rooms that didn't add up. Faces that belonged to places they shouldn't be. He'd wake up at 0, 300 with his heart going like a busted engine, and lie there in the dark doing the breathing exercises the unit's embedded psychologist had taught him, counting down from the ceiling. He called it adjusting. That's what they all called it. Adjusting. His wife, Dana, tall, patient, with a laugh like a screen door in summer, called it something else. She called it disappearing while still sitting at the table. She called it being in the same room and 10,000 miles away. She called it by its real name once, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold. And Marcus looked at her like she'd spoken in a language he was still pretending he didn't understand. They had a daughter, Amara, age 6 at the time, with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and a laugh that reorganized the air in whatever room she was in. Marcus loved that child with a violence that frightened him, not because the love was dangerous, but because of what it revealed. It revealed that he had a self worth protecting, and that self was not doing well. His third deployment ended in March. By June, he was medically separated from the Navy with a service-connected PTSD diagnosis, a knee that had been reconstructed twice, and was threatening a third rebellion, and a commendation letter that was very respectful and very final. The Navy had been his architecture, the structure that held him upright, that told him what time to wake up and what the mission was and who he was in relation to that mission. Without it, he was load-bearing walls with nothing left to bear. Dana tried. She tried the way a person tries to hold a door open against a wind that has already decided where it's going. She scheduled appointments he didn't keep. She researched programs he didn't call. She sat with him through evenings that were just him staring at the television with the sound off, and she kept sitting there because that's what you do when you love someone who has stopped being reachable. Amara started drawing pictures at school. A house, a mom, a dad standing outside the house. Not inside, outside, near the edge of the paper. Her teacher thought it was sweet. Dana took it home and put it in the junk drawer face down. The drinking started as something social. A beer after dinner. A scotch when he couldn't sleep, which was every night. 2 scotches. The bottle moved from the cabinet above the refrigerator to the counter to the end table next to the couch to, eventually, the floor beside the mattress in the spare room, which is where Marcus had migrated because Dana said she couldn't keep watching him not sleep, and he said he understood, and they both pretended that moving to the spare room was consideration rather than surrender. He gained 40 pounds in 8 months. The body that had been forged in salt water and sand, that had carried men and equipment through conditions that would dismantle most human beings, now carried itself to the kitchen and back and called that movement enough. His hands shook a little in the mornings. He noticed. He didn't call anyone about it. There was a morning in November, gray, the kind of gray that sits on a town like a wet blanket and just stays, when Amara knocked on the spare room door at 7 a.m. and said, "Daddy, can you take me to school today?" And Marcus opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Not because he didn't want to, because somewhere between the wanting and the doing, there was a gap he could not get across. He looked at his daughter through the cracked door, her backpack already on, her hair in 2 uneven pigtails that Dana had done in a hurry, and he could not get across the gap. She waited. He said, "Ask your mom, baby." She looked at him for one more second. 6 years old, with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and something behind those eyes that was older than 6. She turned and walked down the hall. Marcus closed the door. He sat on the edge of the mattress in the gray morning light, and he thought about the recruiter's table and the pamphlet and what it had felt like to need something harder than what he had. He thought about how the hardest thing in front of him right now was a door, and he couldn't open it. That was the bottom. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not a single terrible event, but a Tuesday morning in November with a child's footsteps going down the hall, and a man on a mattress on the other side of a door, and the space between them that had become, somehow, the size of everything. The chaos wasn't on fire around him. It was inside him, and he was locked in it. The call came from a man named Darius Cole, and Marcus almost didn't answer. He was on the couch when the phone buzzed, in the particular position he had perfected over months. Half sitting, half collapsed, one arm across his face to block the afternoon light, the television murmuring something he wasn't watching. The phone was on a coffee table next to a glass with 2 fingers of whiskey he'd been nursing for 2 hours because even that had become an effort he had to pace. He looked at the name on the screen. Darius Cole. Turned the phone face down. Looked at the ceiling. Turned it back over. The call was still going. Darius Cole had served alongside Marcus in Afghanistan. Not the same unit. Darius was Army, Special Forces, the kind of professional rivalry that men in those communities maintained with great ceremony and genuine respect. They had shared a FOB for 4 months in Kandahar province, had eaten the same bad food, and complained about it in the same terms, had sat in the same prefab building during the same sandstorm that lasted 3 days, and made the entire earth look like the inside of a paper bag. Darius was from Memphis. He talked with his hands, even over radio. He was funny the way only people who've genuinely suffered are funny. Not performing it, not timing it, just finding the absurd angle on every terrible thing and holding it up so everyone else could see. Marcus hadn't spoken to him in 14 months. He answered. "Tell me you're not sitting on a couch in the dark," Darius said. "No hello. It's afternoon." "That's not a no." Marcus moved the arm from his face. "What do you want, Darius?" "I want you to come to something. And before you say no, hear me out. Because I know you're going to say no. I've been working up to this call for 6 weeks, which tells you how annoying I expect you to be about it. The something was a program, not a clinical program. Not the VA, not a therapist's office, not the thing Marcus had been pointed toward 11 times by 11 different well-meaning people and had driven to the parking lot twice and driven away from twice. This was a 10-day residential program in the mountains of North Carolina, run by veterans for veterans, built on the premise that what broke most of them could not be fixed in a 50-minute hour once a week. That you needed immersion. You needed the mountains and the cold and the physical motion and the other men who didn't need you to explain what you were talking about when you talked about it. "It's not therapy," Darius said. "Well, it's therapy, but it's also hiking. And it's also other guys like us who are struggling in the same ways, and nobody's pretending otherwise. I went 6 months ago." Marcus waited. "I'm still here," Darius said. "I didn't think I was going to be. But I'm still here. And I'm calling you because you're one of the best men I've ever known, and right now I'm fairly certain you're sitting in a dark room in the middle of the afternoon, and that whiskey glass isn't empty." The glass was 3/4 empty. Marcus looked at it. "The program costs nothing," Darius said. "They have scholarships. The only cost is 10 days of your life, which based on what I can tell from the outside, you're not currently using very effectively." It was the most aggressive thing anyone had said to him in a year. Every other person in his life, Dana, his mother, his former commanding officer who had called twice and left voicemails Marcus had listened to 4 times without returning, had approached him the way you approach a dog you're not sure of. Slowly, hands visible, voice low and non-threatening. Darius talked to him like a man. "Send me the information," Marcus said. He almost didn't go. He sat with the printed information sheet on the kitchen table for 6 days. He picked it up and put it down. He told Dana about it and watched something happen in her face that he hadn't seen in a long time, something cautious and luminous at the same time, like a window being opened in a room that's been closed too long. He didn't want to be responsible for that expression. He didn't want to fail it. Amara found a sheet on the 7th day and read the title. "Mountains," she said. "Are you going to the mountains, Daddy?" Thinking about it, she looked at him the way she had through the cracked door. That look that was older than 6. "You should go," she said. "Mountains are good." He packed a bag that night. The drive to North Carolina took 6 hours. He made a Nate because he stopped twice. Once at a gas station outside of Charlotte where he sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes with the engine running, having a very serious internal debate about turning around. And once at a rest stop where he got out and walked in circles in the cold November air until his body stopped doing the thing it did sometimes, the chest tightening thing, the everything is too loud thing, the thing he still called adjusting. The facility was not what he expected. He had expected, in some unarticulated way, institutional. He had expected the particular fluorescent-lit beigeness of recovery spaces, the motivational posters with mountain peaks and sunrise light, the laminate tables, the folding chairs arranged in circles. He had expected to feel like a patient. The property was 12 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills, with a main lodge built from timber that looked like it had grown there rather than been constructed. There were 6 individual cabins. There was a fire pit in a clearing of old oaks. There was a trail that started at the edge of the property and went up. The program director was a woman named Chief. Her actual rank, retired Chief Petty Officer Renata James, Navy, who had served 22 years and now ran this place with a combination of precision and warmth that Marcus had not encountered before in that particular combination. She was 61. She shook his hand like she meant it. "Leave the armor in the truck," she said. Not metaphorically. She was looking at the set of his jaw. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Sure you don't," she said. "Come on." The first 3 days were the worst. There were 9 other men in the cohort. Combat veterans, all of them. 2 Marines, a former Army Ranger, 2 more SEALs, 3 others from various branches whose stories Marcus didn't yet know. Different wars, different theaters, different specific flavors of the same damage. They ate together, hiked together, sat in structured group sessions that Chief facilitated with an openness that made Marcus want to leave the room every time it started, and a quality he couldn't name that kept him from actually leaving. He did not speak in the group sessions for 2 days. He sat. He listened. He watched men who looked like him, built like him, held like him, trained to never let the architecture crack. One at a time, in the sessions or around the fire pit at night, with Chief or with each other or with the 2 therapists on staff who moved through the days quietly and without making anyone feel like they were being observed. Men who had led other men. Men who had made calls that couldn't be unmade. Men who had come home and found that home no longer spoke their language, and they no longer spoke homes. They cried. Marcus had not seen men like these cry, and the seeing of it did something structural to him that he couldn't quite trace. On the 3rd day, the morning hike went longer than the previous ones. Up a ridge that gave out above the tree line into a view that was, there's no other word that earns it, massive. The sky did that thing it does at altitude, where it seems to belong to a different atmosphere than the one you've been living under. The mountains went in every direction. The trees below were small. The town visible in the valley was smaller. Marcus stood at the top and felt his breathing slow. Not forced slow. Not the counting from the ceiling slow. Just slow, the way a tide goes out when there's nothing left to push it. The man next to him on the ridge was the Army Ranger. How? From Cleveland. He had a scar that started under his left ear and stopped at his collarbone, and he'd said exactly 4 words in 2 days of group sessions, which Marcus respected. Theo looked out at the mountains. "Feels like something," he said. Marcus looked out at the mountains. "Yeah," he said. That night, around the fire, Marcus spoke in group for the first time. He didn't plan it. He wasn't looking for his moment. He was listening to another man. One of the Marines, a young one, maybe 28, trying to explain what it felt like when his marriage ended and making a decent attempt at it. And Marcus found himself opening his mouth. It's like he said, and then paused, and everyone waited because you always wait like you're a language. And everyone around you used to speak you. And then something happens and they can't anymore. And you can't translate yourself back. You don't know how. So you just stop talking. The fire crackled. Chief looked at him, not evaluating, just present. "That's it," the young Marine said. "That's exactly it." Something loosened in Marcus's chest. Not broke, not healed, just loosened. The way a knot loosens when you finally stop pulling it tighter and let have a moment of slack. The 4th day, he called Dana. He had texted once to say he'd arrived and was okay. He had not called. He stood outside his cabin in the cold, his breath making small clouds, the mountains visible above the tree line for where he stood. She answered on the 2nd ring. "Hey," she said. Her voice was careful. "Hey." He looked at the mountains. "I talked today. In the group. A beat. Marcus." "I know. I'm glad," she said. Her voice was doing the cautious, luminous thing again. He let himself look at it this time. He let himself be responsible for it. "How's Amara?" "She's been drawing pictures of mountains," Dana said. "She says she's sending them to you with her mind." He laughed. Out loud. Fully. The sound surprised him, not because he'd forgotten he could laugh, but because he'd forgotten it felt like that, like something releasing upward. The fifth day, they introduced a new element to the program. Not hiking, not group, something that Chief called, with the particular directness Marcus had come to recognize as her signature, the build. The men were given an area of the property, a section of trail that had been damaged by a storm, overgrown, broken down in places where the terrain had simply given up on holding together. The task was to rebuild it. Actual physical labor. Hauling rock, clearing debris, cutting back the overgrowth, installing drainage where the water had been winning. Marcus picked up a sledgehammer. He had not felt useful in over a year. He brought the hammer down on a section of compacted earth that needed breaking, and the impact went up through his arms and into his shoulders, and his body said, "Yes, this is what we are for." He swung again. Again. The ranger worked next to him. Two of the other SEALs joined. They worked without talking, the particular nonverbal communication of men who know how to build something together, who have done it in conditions where building it wrong had consequences. By the afternoon, the trail was beginning to hold again. Marcus stood at the edge of the rebuilt section, sweat drying cold on his neck, looking down the trail at what they'd made, and Chief appeared at his elbow. "How's that feel?" she asked. He thought about the spare room, the curtains, the 40 pounds, the door he couldn't open. "Like something," he said. She nodded. That was enough. That night he lay in his cabin and listened to the mountains be quiet, and for the first time in over a year, the ceiling didn't feel like it was lowering. He still had 5 days left, and for the first time in a very long time, he wanted to know what happened next. Coming home is its own kind of courage, not the visible kind, not the kind that gets documented or awarded or pointed at from across a gymnasium. The invisible kind, the kind that requires you to walk back into the exact same rooms where you fell apart and decide, without any guarantee, that this time will be different. The kind where the only audience is the person you're trying to become, and that person isn't cheering yet. That person is watching. Marcus drove home from North Carolina on a Thursday morning in late November. The mountains had been in his rearview mirror for an hour before they disappeared. And even then, he kept checking the mirror the way you check on something you don't want to lose sight of. He had Chief's number in his phone. He had the number of Theo, the ranger, who had shaken his hand on the last morning with the grip of a man making a promise. He had a folder of materials. Not homework. Chief had been specific about that. Not homework, just tools, just things to come back to when the architecture started to crack again. He had 10 days of something he still didn't have a clean word for. Not healing exactly. Not fixed. Something earlier than fixed. Something like the moment you stop bleeding long enough to look at the wound and understand what you're actually working with. He had called Dana from the parking lot before he left. "I'm coming home," he said. "I know," she said. "I made the guest room back into your room." He understood what she meant. She meant, "I dismantled the symbol. I moved the furniture back. I'm offering you the shape of before without the demand that you be what you were before." "Thank you," he said. She didn't say you're welcome. She said, "Drive safe," which is how people who have loved each other through damage say "I love you" when love feels too large and too fragile to carry at full size. The house looked the same from the outside. Of course it did. 10 days and a house doesn't change. But Marcus stood in the driveway for a moment before going in, looking at the front door, thinking about the other door, the one to the spare room on a gray November morning, and the gap he couldn't cross. He walked to the front door, opened it. Amara hit him at approximately the velocity of a small planet. She was 6 pounds and 47 words ahead of him before he'd fully registered the impact. Arms around his neck, face against his collarbone, talking about the mountain drawing she'd been doing with her mind and how she'd sent him the energy of the big one, the one she'd seen on a nature show that had snow on it even in summer. Had he gotten it? Did he feel it? She had been very focused. He held her. He held her the way you hold something when you understand for the first time in a long time that you are allowed to have it. "I felt it," he said. She leaned back and looked at him with those eyes. "You look different," she said. "Ow!" She tilted her head. 6 years old, considering him with the seriousness of a woman conducting a formal assessment. "More here," she said. Dana was in the kitchen doorway. She had watched the whole thing. When Marcus looked up, she smiled. Not the careful smile of the past year. Not the one that was managing something. The real one. The screen door in summer one. He was not naive. He knew what wasn't fixed. He knew the chest-tightening thing would come back. He knew there would be nights when the ceiling lowered and mornings when the gap between the wanting and the doing felt like a canyon. He knew the drinking had to be addressed in real terms with real support, not willpower and intention, which he'd already tried and which had a known outcome. He knew that Dana had spent a year managing their family alone while sitting next to him, and that the damage in a marriage doesn't reverse because one person goes to the mountains and comes back with better tools. Damage like that is rebuilt the same way that Trail was rebuilt, slowly, with physical labor, over time, in partnership one section at a time. He knew all of this. He also knew that Amara had said more here, and she was right, and that had to be where you start. The weeks that followed were non-montage. Life is not a montage. He kept his appointment with the VA therapist. For the first time, actually kept it, sat down in the office, looked at the man across from him, and said, "I need you to know I've been showing up to this appointment in parking lots for 8 months and leaving." He said that out loud. The therapist said, "Thank you for telling me," and they started from there. He joined a men's group that Darius had connected him with, not online, in person, in a church fellowship hall on Tuesday nights, a circle of chairs that smelled like burnt coffee and hard-won honesty. Former military, mostly. A few first responders. Men who had found the same thing Marcus had found in North Carolina, which is that the presence of other people who don't require explanation is one of the most medicinal things in the world. He sat in those chairs every Tuesday. He talked. He listened. He laughed, sometimes in a way that comes from recognizing yourself in another person's story, which is comedy in its truest form. The drinking he addressed with a sobriety counselor named Garrett, who was 34 and a former Marine and had been sober for 7 years and had the kind of matter-of-fact clarity about the whole thing that made Marcus feel like he was being helped rather than managed. He did not white-knuckle his way through. He learned. He understood, for the first time, that the bottle hadn't been the problem. It had been a solution to a problem he hadn't had the tools to address. Now he had some tools. The solution was no longer necessary. He lost the 40 pounds over 8 months. Not because he was punishing his body back into its old shape. The old shape was a product of the old life, and the old life was not what he was rebuilding toward. He moved because movement was one of the tools. Because Chief had been right, the body keeps the wound, and the body has to be part of the healing. He ran in the mornings, not the driven, performance-oriented running of his SEAL years, but the quieter kind, where the sound of his own feet on the pavement was something to follow rather than beat. Dana noticed. They didn't have a dramatic reconciliation. There was no single moment of catharsis around a kitchen table where everything was said and wept over and resolved. What happened was slower and more real than that. They began to share the same room again. Not just physically, they began to occupy the same emotional space. They began to talk at dinner, first about Amara, then about small things, then about larger ones. They began to disagree sometimes and resolve it the same night rather than letting it compound. Marcus started taking Amara to school. Some mornings were easier than others. Some mornings he stood in the hallway for a long moment with his hand on the door frame. But he opened the door. He always opened the door. There was a Tuesday in April, 8 months after North Carolina, when Marcus was sitting in the church fellowship hall before the men's group started, helping set up chairs. A new man came in. Young, maybe 25, the military posture that doesn't leave even when everything else does. Jaw set the way you set a jaw when you're working very hard, not to let anything show. Eyes doing the thing Marcus recognized because he had done it, scanning exits, cataloging threats, performing normalcy with the focus of someone performing surgery. The young man stood in the doorway, not quite entering. Marcus stopped setting up chairs. "Come on in," he said. "Coffee's bad. The company's decent." The young man looked at him. "I don't really know why I'm here," he said. Marcus thought about a recruiter's table in a gymnasium. He thought about a pamphlet. He thought about a phone call he almost didn't answer, and a mountain parking lot, and a sledgehammer, and a trail. Yeah, he said. That's exactly why you're here. The young man came in. In January of the following year, Marcus received his certification as a peer support specialist through the VA's peer support program. The certification meant that he was qualified to work alongside mental health professionals in providing support to veterans, not as a clinician, but as something that no clinical training can manufacture. A man who had been there, who had sat on the floor of a dark room and decided, eventually, to get up, who had driven to a parking lot 8 times and driven away 8 times before he finally walked through the door, who understood in his body, not just his mind, what it cost to ask for help. He started working at the VA 2 days a week, then 3, then 5. He sat with veterans who were in the places he had been, men and women who had come home and found that home was in a foreign language, that the people who loved them were separated from them by a gap they couldn't get across. He didn't fix them. He didn't pretend he could. He sat in a room with them and stayed there. That's the thing they don't tell you about the hardest kind of courage. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like sitting in a chair in a fluorescent lit room with a cup of bad coffee present. It looks like Tuesday nights in a fellowship hall. It looks like a man in a driveway, standing still then moving. Dana came to watch him speak at a VA event in March. He had been asked to share his story. Not as a presentation, not with slides, just standing in a microphone and talking honestly, which was harder in its way than anything he had ever been asked to do in the field. No training for it. No rehearsal. Just the truth, organized in the order it happened. Amara had made him a drawing to take. Mountains. A man at the top. He was inside the drawing. He stood at the microphone and looked out at the room. 40, 50 veterans, some with partners beside them, some alone, all of them carrying the particular weight that only people who have carried it can recognize on each other. He thought about what he would have needed to hear, sitting on that mattress in November, on the floor of the burning chaos he had been locked inside of. I want to start by telling you something that took me a long time to learn, he said. Asking for help is not a thing that happens to weak men. It's a thing that weak men can't do. He paused. It took me a SEAL Trident, 3 deployments, 11 years of service, and 1 phone call from a man in Memphis before I understood that. A few people in the room laughed. The kind of laugh that means, I know that story. The kind that means, I'm in it right now. I'm not going to tell you it's easy, he said. I'm not going to tell you it gets simple. I'm going to tell you it gets possible. And possible is enough to start with. He talked for 20 minutes. He told them about the spare room and the curtains and the ceiling fan that clicked on its 3rd rotation. He told them about driving to parking lots. He told them about the mountains and the trail and the sledgehammer and what it felt like to be useful to something again. He told them about his daughter, who sent mountain energy with her mind and drew him inside the pictures. When he was done, there was silence, and then the kind of applause that is less about the performance and more about the recognition. The sound a group of people makes when they've heard something true. Dana found him afterward in the hallway outside the room. She put both hands on the sides of his face, something she hadn't done in a long time, and looked at him. That's you, she said. He knew what she meant. The man who gave that speech. The man who opened the door on Tuesday mornings. The man in Amara's drawing, standing at the top, inside the frame. That was Marcus. Rebuilt. Not back to before. Before was never coming back. And chasing before is how men stay lost. Forward. Differently structured. Load-bearing walls still standing, but carrying something worth holding up. Outside, the April light was doing what April light does. Thin and specific, landing on everything with the careful attention of something that knows it won't last. He stood in it for a moment. His phone buzzed. A text from Theo, the ranger from Cleveland. Just a photo. A mountain trail. Some elevation, snow still on the ridgeline. Below it, still here. Marcus looked at the photo for a long time. Then he typed back the only thing that needed saying. Still here. He put the phone in his pocket. Walked back to where Dana was waiting. Drove home to where Amara was waiting, in a house that smelled like their life, To eat dinner around a table where the conversation wouldn't always be easy and the gaps wouldn't always close immediately and the work of it never fully finished. The best things never are. He opened the door. He walked in.